Good morning again. Our conversation today is around the topic of communion with God. Communion with God. And this comes from the Global Heart Vision, which says we see a world in which spiritual guidance is valued. In which spiritual guidance is valued, which we take a little time to listen to Spirit before we open our mouths or take our actions or anything like that. I don't know about you, but there's times that I wish that I had listened to spiritual guidance prior to opening the mouth or doing some action, right? You know, and so it's a wonderful invitation to do that. And we're working, for those who are not familiar with that, on a theme for the whole year of creating a world that works for all. That's our theme for the year. And this isn't just our church. This is actually almost all, or many of the religious science churches around the world are working on this theme. So we're working on bringing this consciousness to the idea of a world that works for all, which I think is powerful in an election year, isn't it? There's all this stuff going on over here, you know, and then we're sitting here doing our best to be the consciousness that stands solidly in creating a world that works for all. So join me in that vision. So I looked up the definition of communion just so I could talk about it. It comes from the Latin communio, and it simply means mutual participation. Mutual participation. We're both playing in this process. And so there's a couple of guidelines, actually there's 3 guidelines that I wanted to use for that. And the first one comes out of the Hebrew Bible. And it says, I am the Lord thy God. You shall have no other gods but me. That's in Exodus 20-2. The second one was the reading that we heard this morning, which comes from Jesus. And in most of this, Jesus is actually quoting Deuteronomy, which is also still in the Hebrew Bible. And this is actually, he says it, but he's kind of reminding the people, this is, if you're a fan of NCIS, which I am, this is what I call a Gibbs head slap. You know, for the people who were asking him the questions, it's like, you know, hey, you know, what's the greatest commandment? And it's just like, well, duh. You know, you've already been told. Let me remind you what it is out of Deuteronomy. And it is, hear, O Israel. And who's Israel? We're Israel. See, the Bible is always talking directly to us. And if you're new here, we don't do the Bible as a literal thing, but we do it as it is, what's the message? What is it speaking to me? Hear, O Israel. Hear, O my true self, my soul. The Lord our God is one Lord, one God. Same thing we say, right? One God. And you must love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your might. This is the first commandment. That's it. There's one more that I want to quote, and this comes from the Bhagavad Gita, a wonderful, fabulous Hindu text. Ignorance is destroyed by knowledge of the self within, and that's the capital self. Ignorance is destroyed. It can no longer stand when we know that true self within us. When we get that true spiritual self. It goes on, the light of knowledge shines like the sun, revealing the supreme Brahman, the supreme God within us, the supreme God all around. Those who cast off sin, which is misunderstanding, those who cast off sin through this knowledge, absorbed in the Lord and established in him as their one God, as their one goal and refuge, are not reborn as separate creatures. We are reborn, but not as separate creatures. If you're like me, at times you felt like a separate creature, right? You know, stranger in a strange land. I remember that book from my high school and college days. You know, we feel like we're walking through a strange land. But he says when we're in that knowledge, and the truth is we're being reborn constantly. We're being reborn moment by moment by moment by moment. Okay? And when we are being reborn not as separate creatures, but as an awareness of the oneness in which we live, move, and have our being and exist. Okay? So let's break all this down for a moment. Let's go back to that first one. No other gods but me. Now, when I was a kid and I read this, my first thought of this was, that sounds like a really jealous guy. Yeah, you got to worship me and nobody else. Okay? I've met a few people like that. Okay? But this passage has multiple levels of meaning. And remember that it's being written at the time for a tribe that was in trouble, a tribe that was in transition and a tribe that needed some kind of firm guidelines for, this is how to operate. So there's one level of consciousness, that kind of primary, undisciplined level of consciousness that is sort of like, you got to do this, okay? But there's a reason for you got to do this. There's always a reason for you got to do this. And so we look at the deeper level of that. And the deeper level of that is the same thing that Jesus talks about when he says, seek ye first the kingdom of heaven. It's that consciousness is cause. Consciousness is cause, not the other stuff. And so what this passage is basically saying is, stop believing in things other than this one infinite presence. Stop believing in the rest of the stuff. Now, what's the rest of the stuff? Our outer circumstances, our fears, our belief in lack, other people as being our source or our problem, all this other stuff. These are our, if you will, false gods before us. But I'm not paying attention directly and looking directly at the divine and seeing the divine and consciously engaged, constantly in communion with the divine, then I'm engaged with other things, and those are my false gods. And I don't know about you, but I've gone down the path of some false gods that have wrapped me around, their little finger for a long time, right? And so this is the invitation to stop doing that. And the final thing to do, to be aware of, is to viewing myself separately from divine guidance. Hey, I can do it. I can do it myself. Thanks God, but I don't need you. I can do it myself. And we've all done this. Oh, many of us have done this. Maybe I shouldn't quite generalize that far. But many of us have done this. We forget, and we don't tap into our divine guidance. So what that first premise is, have no other gods but me. Look, come to this wonderful source of love, of power, of abundance, of grace, of glory. Come to that first. And then out of that, everything else flows. So that's the communion with the divine. If I'm putting this other stuff first, I cut off my communion. Now, God never cuts off our communion. God is always, it's like the broadcast, it's always going. Next week, we're going to talk about the topic is God is always speaking to us. And so this is kind of a two-part talk, you might say. Okay? God is always broadcasting, but are we tuned in? Okay? So God doesn't cut it off from me. I love Jesus' story, as many of you know, of the prodigal, the one that's labeled the prodigal son. I think it's actually the story of the loving father. It's a mislabeled story as far as I'm concerned. But the son who takes off with the inheritance and goes around and ends up, stopping pigs and finally comes back. There's no point in that story where the father stops loving the son. There's no point in that story where the son couldn't have come back home and the father would have had exactly the same reaction that he had when the kid came home, right? Okay? That father was in love. That love was never cut off. Okay? And so God's love for us, that infinite presence's love for us, is never cut off. Okay? But we sometimes operate as like we have this beautiful power center right here, and we go, I'm not going to use that. I'm going to try and generate it all, over here. Okay? I'm going to stand beside a beautiful, crystal clear spring of perfect water and go, I'm really thirsty and I don't have any water around. Okay? I don't know about you, I've done that. Number 2, one God and love it with all of me. Okay? We already get the idea there's just one God. Love it with all of me. Let's break that down. Love it with our soul. Our soul is our spiritual self, and our soul is easily in love with God because it's that aspect of ourselves that is most directly connected with our deeper infinite self, if you will, right? The question is, do I listen to my capital S self? Do I listen to that soul? Do I take the time to connect with that soul? How much am I in touch with my own spiritual self, which is that part of me that's in love with the divine? And so it's a reminder to say, how much am I, and do I connect with that? Secondly, to love it with our heart. Our heart is our emotions. Okay? God isn't just a nice idea that's, impersonal, and we just think about it and we contemplate. No, we got to get passionate about it. We got to get, as I like to say, quoting Will Smith, we got to get jiggy with God, We have to get passionate. We have to involve our emotions. We have to involve our heart and our love for the divine. So we have to feel that love. Next is our mind. And the mind gives structure. The mind is the intellect. Sue and I just a moment ago were talking about the father-mother aspect of God, and we need both. Okay? And in a way, the heart is the mother aspect of God, and the mind is the father aspect of God. And we need both to create something. Okay? And so the mind is that intellectual structure. It helps to guide our emotions into expression. On the shadow side of that, on the downside of that, it can be that God is just a concept without the rest of our being involved. And sometimes as religious scientists, we get stuck in the mentality of the divine. If we get stuck in the mentality of God, that's all we're doing is we're thinking about it. But I want to invite us to, and I did this, I mentioned this I think last week, to get our hearts involved, to get our passion involved, to get our whole being involved in this communion with the divine. There's a yogi practice called Bhakti Yogi, I believe, or Bhakti Yogi, which is that devotional practice to the divine. It's the chanting to the divine. It's the loving. It's just the being in pure love with the divine. You know, and this is something in my own private practice I lean towards. You know, and it's just you know, you're in love with the divine. And so then you bring in your mind also give some wisdom and some structure to that process. And finally, love the Lord God with your whole might. What is your might? It's your body, it's your actions, it's your activity. Do we take this love into action? See, a mother's love, we're talking Mother's Day today, a mother's love is taken ideally into action. You don't want a mom who just sits there and goes, oh, I love my baby. You want a mom who gets involved, right? Yes? Okay? So he takes action. It takes expression of that love. So it takes all four of those, our soul, our heart, our mind, and our being, our might, our body, our getting involved. You know, as Paul later says, faith without works is dead, but so is love. Love without expression is worthless. Okay? Yeah. Some of us have been in expression with people and you say, I love you, and they go, uh-huh. Me too. Ditto. Yep. How does that feel? It doesn't feel good, right? So we express that. The last one that I want to look at then is the quote from the Bhagavad Gita, and we kind of already talked about that a little bit as I was reading through it. Ignorance is destroyed by the knowledge of the self within. If I take the time to know the self within, the self is the infinite wisdom and intelligence of the universe, right? That's what the capital S, that's what the God self within me is. And if I take the time to know that, I get to operate from that infinite intelligence. And I tend to make fewer errors or take journeys, let's put it that way, that are not perhaps the most easy, peace-filled, joyous, or direct towards where I want to be. Okay? And so if I know that self within, I'm operating less and less out of ignorance and more out of alignment with the divine. And then the light of this knowledge is so bright that it shines like the sun, and it reveals the true self of us. If we take that time, it reveals who we truly are and what we're truly operating in. Will we take the time to practice that? So all of this still, as I mentioned, resonates with what I talked about last week, that we have to be fully engaged, not just intellectually knowing of it. We have to have our heart wisdom engaged. We have to have our soul, we have to have our heart, our mind, and our body, all of it engaged. And followed by activity, which is creating a result. I want to talk about that creating a result, the activity a little bit, because here we call it by a Hindu term called seva. And seva is defined as selfless service to and as spirit. And it's without any expectation of reward or result. And that's the definition of seva. And so it's the expression of that, what I call the namaste consciousness. Namaste, you know, as many of you know, is the God within me beholds, recognizes, loves, sees, serves the God within you. And if we're all operating out of that, if we start bouncing back and forth with that, we create a beautiful process in which we create a world that works for all. If my first question for you, when I see you is not what can you give me, but rather what can I give you? How can I be of service to you? How can I love you more? And if you're operating in that same consciousness, we just expand and spin up the love, right? Okay. Michael Beckwith invites us to move out of a getting economy and into a giving economy. Out of a getting economy and into a giving economy. And that's not just as a nation, but our own personal economy. We create our own weather system, if you will. We create our own economy around us. It doesn't matter what the nation or the world is doing. We have the power to create around us our own economy. And so it's the invitation to do that, to start practicing that giving. The way I like to think of this is making love with God. Making love, good love making, takes full participation on both parts, right? Mutual participation. Okay? And it involves passion, it involves your body, it involves your mind, it involves your deep spirit. And so if we're communing with the divine, if we're making love with the divine in that practice, in that process, we're totally engaged with it. And we're in love and we're in bliss. And we're in that union. So I'm going to invite you this week to make love with God. How does that sound? And by the way, let God make love with you. It's a mutual thing, right? So we have to be open. We have to have the doors open, as well as it's not just a one-way street. So our 3 spiritual practices this week. First, take the time to open the doors. Take the time for communion with Spirit. Take the time to actually listen, to meditate, to vision, to open up to this divine wisdom, this divine love, this divine guidance. Allow ourselves to take the time. So often we're so busy doing stuff, that we don't take the time to sit and receive. And so that's the first thing I invite you to do this week, is to take the time to sit and receive. And to engage your whole being in this process. So it's not just a mental process, but to engage your heart. How can I engage my heart in opening the Spirit more? How can I engage my mind? How can I engage my soul? How can I engage my body, my might, in being open to Spirit more? And then secondly, be aware of where you do find it easy to commune with Spirit, and strengthen where you find it difficult. And so we talked about the 4 aspects. Let's do that. 4 aspects. Number 1, soul. Number 2, our heart. Number 3, our mind. And number 4, our body. Which are the ones that you're already really good at? Play with those, but also find out which one of the ones that you say, I feel a little less comfortable with that. How can I strengthen that one? How can I be more engaged in that one? And take the time to practice that. And then finally, the 3rd spiritual practice is practice seva this week. Practice being of service to God with no expectation of result or a reward. I'm just practicing, I'm just playing with the idea of being of service. If I look at every situation and say, how can I bring myself, how can I serve this situation? How can I serve this person? And maybe as simple as just a smile to somebody who's looking grumpy. And maybe it's just as simple as looking a homeless person who's standing there with a sign in the eye and just simply nodding and acknowledging them as a person instead of driving by and completely ignoring them. It may be something really, really small, or maybe something really, really large. But practicing that idea of seva, how can I give, how can I serve with no idea of thought or return? So that's our 3 spiritual practices. Number 1, take time to commune with Spirit. Number 2, be aware of where you find it easy and strengthen where you find it difficult. And number 3, practice seva. Are you willing to play with that this week? Yeah, me too. So quote number 5, I want to close with our quote, also from the Bhagavad Gita. The ignorant work for their own profit. The wise work for the welfare of the world, without thought for themselves. Perform all work carefully, guided by compassion. So this week I invite you to work for the welfare of the world. We oftentimes talk about what I do affects 7 generations back and 7 generations forward. What if everything I did, I consciously asked myself, how is this going to affect the whole world and the 7 generations forward? And start to practice that. So I invite you to play with that. Let's move into prayer. And so we open to that Father, Mother, God. We open to that heart and soul, that heart and mind, that deep sense of the power of each aspect of God, the Father and the Mother. The heart energy, the love, the creativity. We open to that. We open to the life energy, the light, the power. We open to that. We recognize that this infinite presence, beyond all names, is all of that and more. It is the fabulous abundance of good, the fabulous abundance of love, the fabulous abundance of joy of this universe. And then we recognize that because it is infinite, that we have to be one of God. We have to be one of it because if it's infinite, there's nothing outside of it. And so we are one of that infinite presence right here, right now. That is the truth of who we are. We ourselves already are one of the love, one of the power, one of the life, one of the abundance of good, one of the abundance of joy. We are that right now. I am that, you are that, each of us is one of that right here, right now. Whether we remember it, whether we forget it, whether we believe it or not, it is still the truth of who we are, because there's no other way to be. And so from this awareness, I speak my word that this week we go forward and we practice that communion with God, recognizing God in the face of each and every person we see, in the circumstances and situations of everything we encounter, and we bring that communion with God, first centered in that, and then bringing that communion out to everything that we do, everyone we meet, everything we engage. We open up to that heart energy, we open up to that love, we guide it, we direct it, we let it express through us. We remember the words that whatever you do to these, the least of my brethren, you also do to me. And so we serve the divine. And as we serve the divine, we serve ourselves. It's impossible to separate the two. And so we bring this consciousness of service, this consciousness of seva, this consciousness of life energy, this consciousness of love into this week in the most beautiful, perfect ways possible. And then because the universe returns to us, reflects to us whatever we put back or put out to it, whatever that is, it comes back to us. What comes back to us is love and service and joy and greater good, deeper and deeper peace. And so for all the gifts that are given, for all the gifts that are received this week by all of us, I am so grateful. I know that this is already so. This is moving into form because we have declared it to be so. We are open to it. We say yes to that in our being. And the law moves to express it in form and expression through us. And so it does. And together we affirm, and so it is. Thank you.